Chapter 23. Carter. "So are we seeing a new Carter now?" Tucker asked as he grabbed his bag and shut his locker. "What do you mean?" Carter asked. He didn't think he'd been playing that differently, although if he was, he actually felt better about his performance and not worse. "I mean, I've seen April in the box the last 2 home games. Usually I never see the women you give your tickets to more than once." "Oh, that." Carter hadn't shared his recent life events with the whole team, just Jefferson and Mason, whom he was closer to, but he'd assumed the others had heard. "Yeah, I guess you could say I'm turning over a new leaf. I lost some friends recently, and that experience gave me a new perspective." "Well, I'm glad," Tucker said, clapping him on the shoulder. "April seems nice, and I think you'll find you enjoy getting to know one woman well, rather than learning a new one each week." Carter smiled. "It's working so far." Things had been awkward for a few days after he apologized to April, but he couldn't fault her for that. He'd been awful. The fact that she'd been willing to give it another try already said a lot about her. Of course, he could still sense hesitation on her end, but each time they attended church together or spent an evening just talking, he felt it lessen. He'd backed off on physical touch as well, so as not to pressure her, but surprisingly, he found himself satisfied just holding her hand or sitting near her. "I'd wager we'll be attending another wedding before the end of the season." Tucker chuckled and waved as he walked out of the locker room. Carter wasn't as sure about that. They still hadn't even decided what they were doing about the baby, much less the rest of their lives. But the thought of marriage no longer seemed as scary. Uncertain, perhaps, but not scary. Grabbing his bag, he slung it over his shoulder and headed toward the box to get April. Though it probably wasn't the discussion for tonight. He knew their future and the future of the baby would be a discussion they would need to have before too much longer. He climbed the stairs to the box, surprised to see that April wasn't the last woman left. There were several other women still milling around, although he did notice that Lucia was not among them. With Jefferson's daughter often with them at the games, that wasn't really surprising. Late games and little children didn't mix, which left him wondering about his own situation. Would that be him next season? "That was a great game," April said, giving him a hug as she reached his side. They hadn't kissed since he'd come back, but he hoped she'd be open to it again soon. "Thanks." It was different, having April at the home games, but there was a certain feeling of familiarity that he enjoyed. He didn't have to worry about forgetting her name, and there was no awkward silence between them that he felt the need to fill. At least, not usually. "Do you want to grab some dinner?" "Actually, I ate here, and I'm exhausted. Do you think we could call it an early night tonight?" April wasn't even showing yet, but Carter, being no expert on pregnancy and how it affected women, was in no position to argue. Besides, he could grab some food at her place. Though Lucia no longer lived there, she still dropped off leftover food for April occasionally, knowing that not only did April not cook much, but she often worked late hours. "No worries," he said, taking her hand. "Would you be okay if I snagged something from your fridge?" "Not at all," April said with a smile. He laced his fingers with hers as he led the way to the parking lot. Other than April, he couldn't remember the last time he'd enjoyed holding a woman's hand, much less the last time he'd wanted to initiate it. Whether it was April, or the baby, or God making a change in his life, something was definitely at work. When they were both buckled in, he started the car and headed for April's house. "Do you have a late night tomorrow?" he asked as he pulled onto the main highway. The team generally had Monday off, so players could recoup from the games before practice began again. April sighed. I think my last appointment is at 6. That meant she wouldn't be home until 8 at least, depending on how much cleaning up she had to do after the client's massage. Do you want me to come meet you when you leave? He didn't like the thought of her being in her building alone after dark, and he certainly didn't like her walking out to her car alone in the dark. She chuckled and shook her head. I think I'll be okay. The office is in a pretty safe part of town, and I park right outside. Carter tapped his fingers on the wheel. While he definitely cared about her safety, his concern was probably a little more tied to the baby. Ever since he'd found out he was a father, something in him had shifted, and the need to protect this new life was growing stronger within him every day. It doesn't have to be tonight, April, but we need to talk about the baby soon. I know. Her words came out as a sigh. I just haven't figured out exactly what I want to do yet. He hated that he'd put her in this position, where she was having to figure something out. But he also hated that he felt like he had little say. He understood that the pregnancy affected her more personally, but it was still his child as well, and he wasn't sure he would be able to give the baby up when the time came. Of course, he could raise the baby on his own, but that also came with complications. It would just be so much easier if she realized she wanted to raise the baby with him. As he turned onto her road, he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. There had been cars behind him since the stadium, but April's place was on a dead-end street. Cars didn't turn down this road unless they lived here. He waited for the car to turn into any of the other drives along the street. But when he neared April's house and the car was still behind them, his stomach knotted and he continued past her place. Carter, you missed the turn." She tapped his arm as if sure that he'd been daydreaming and that was why he'd not pulled into her house. "I think someone might be following us," he said, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead and the rearview mirror. "There's no way I'm turning into your drive until I know they aren't watching." "What?" April twisted around in her seat to glance out the back window. "Are you sure?" "Not 100%, but they haven't turned anywhere yet." He drove through the circle at the end of the street and tried to peer into the other cars' windows as they passed, but it was too dark and the light from his headlights blocked his vision. "I'm going to drive around for a minute until I'm sure they're not following us." The fear in April's voice twisted his gut as she nodded and whispered, "Okay." He hated that he'd scared her, especially if it was for no reason. "I'm sure it's nothing. I'm probably just being overprotective," he said, trying to ease the tension that now filled the car. He turned on the first side street and wove up and down the roads, keeping an eye on his rearview mirror for the car. When nothing appeared in his mirror after a few minutes, his body finally began to relax. "I guess they were either lost or using the circle to turn around to park the opposite way," he said, as he turned down April's street once again. "Well, that's a relief," April said, sinking back into the seat. Then suddenly her hand whipped out to smack his arm. "Don't scare me like that." "I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to scare you." He'd been trying to protect her and the baby, something he was pretty sure he'd be doing for a long time to come, regardless of her decision. He reached for her hand and squeezed it. "I'm glad it turned out to be nothing." "Me too," she said. Though he'd dismissed the car out loud, Carter still kept his eyes peeled as he drove back to April's house. But when they pulled into the driveway without incident, he let his armor drop. They were safe, at least for now.